if I can ask you to start recording. It looks as though you've started doing that. So I'm going to start by welcoming all of you to the 2023 Loren Le Clezio Lecture. And the great news is our presenter has agreed for us to record this session. So it will be made available to people through the departmental website afterwards. It does also mean if you don't want to be in the movie, please make sure you keep your video off. Please make sure you stay mute. What we will do is I'm going to start with a very brief background about this lecture. Then I'm going to introduce Professor Theron and she will give her lecture. And hopefully at the end, there will be some time for question and answer discussion with all of you. So please feel free to make your notes or have your questions ready. You're also welcome to put them in the chat if you like as we go along, but we'll only answer them at the end of the lecture. So let me start by just telling you something about the Loren Le Clezio Lecture and Loren Le Clezio the person. So this lovely logo you see is the Departmental Social Responsiveness Committee logo. And this lecture is the kind of main annual lecture that we do in the Social Responsiveness Committee in the Department of Psychiatry. For those who haven't met me, I'm Professor Petrus de Vries. I'm in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and I was the previous chair of the Social Responsiveness Committee. So let me tell you something about the person. Loren Le Clezio was a developmental neuropsychologist. She was a master's student at the University of Cape Town between 2012 and 14. Then she did a PhD between 2014 and 2017. And she was an author of 7 papers on tuberous sclerosis complex, which is a rare genetic disorder associated with many neuropsychiatric difficulties. And she was a remarkable person, a real champion for working in collaboration with individuals and families and communities affected. And she was a very strong believer that research can be a tool for empowering communities. She very sadly died in 2018 after a short battle with cancer. And she left behind a legacy of her research. She left behind a beautiful family, a business. She was an entrepreneur, a very, very powerful woman who really had a vision for the future. And in honor of her work, we decided as a Social Responsiveness Committee that we were going to have an annual lecture in her honor. Here are some pictures of Loren in different actions at conferences and socially and listening and winning awards and being generally friendly and beautiful. And so the Loren Le Clezio Lecture is an annual lecture in the department as part of our Social Responsiveness Forum. And we decided to invite a lecture by somebody who exemplifies the spirit of socially responsive and community-based participatory research, very much in the spirit of Loren's work and her own passions. And we'd like to prioritize female scientists as well in the honor of Loren's memory. And so over the last number of years, I delivered the first one because we introduced it. We had Professor Marita de Jonge from the Netherlands, Lebo Molitsane from UKZN, Professor Lionel Green-Thompson, our Dean. Last year, we had Professor Liz Pellicano from University College London. And so it is great for us this year to have Professor Linda Theron from the University of Pretoria. And I think at this point, I'm going to stop sharing and invite Linda to start sharing her screen as I introduce her. So Professor Linda Theron is a registered educational psychologist, and she's a full professor at the University of Pretoria in the Department of Educational Psychology. She's also a member of the Optentia Research Entity at Northwest University, where she's done a lot of work in the years gone by. And she's also a member of the South African Academy of Sciences. She's associate editor of 2 different journals, one on adolescent health. She's a highly rated scientist in the country, and she was my successor as the president of the South African Association of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and Allied Professions. And she has an intriguing title for her research, because most of her research passion is around adolescent resilience and how we can understand and support adolescent resilience very much in a local and in an African context. So, Linda, we're extremely grateful for your time and that you're able to join us today. And I think it's absolutely appropriate for us in Youth Month to listen to you talk about the business of youth resilience, what it's about. And I like your saying it's not a DIY business. So we're very much looking forward to what you're going to teach us and tell us and remind us of today. So with that, Linda, over to you.
First, Prof. De Vries, if I need to speak formally, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. An even bigger thank you to you and to the committee for the invitation to honor Dr. Loren Le Clezio today. And I start with a slide in her honor, because I would like to dedicate the ethos of today's lecture, the idea that resilience is not a do-it-yourself job, to her legacy. She became one of our ancestors far too soon, I think. I acknowledge the fact that she was a mother and a wife, and that in addition to that, she was this inspiring scholar who was really invested in participatory work. And what her legacy teaches us is that we dare not assume that the well-being of young people in our country and elsewhere is their business, is a do-it-yourself job. And so that is going to be the thesis of what I would like us to talk about today. I will try to speak for no longer than around 40 minutes so that we do still have some time for questions. And I'm going to start by setting the pernicious context of one of the biggest challenges, which I'm sure you all know, associated with structural violence. And that's the fact that so few of the young people in our country have access to employment and to training opportunities. And so if you read the newspapers, if you listen to the radio, then I'm sure that you too are familiar with the stats. I'll remind you, in case you may not be, currently in 2023, the South African Statistical Service of our country puts youth unemployment between the ages of 15 and 34 at around 46.5%. If you narrow that age range and you only look at young people between the ages of 15 and 24, then it's a staggering 61%. And so the young people in our country, even though they are supposedly born free, even though they are not shackled, so to say, by many of the obstacles that people in our country faced prior to 1994, they fight this battle to have dignified lives because we don't offer them employment and training opportunities. And while the young people in our country who do not have access to employment and who are not involved in educational training are certainly not homogeneous, it is true to say that sadly, the challenges of unemployment and of not being involved in education and in training are more likely to affect young women than young men. But I want us to move the focus. It stays within the same context, but I want to suggest that if we focus on these really toxic challenges that our young people are grappling with, we are probably only seeing half of the story. Because as you can see on the slide that I'm showing you, although the headline to this article was focused on the risks, the story in the photograph is telling us about the incredible capacity of so many young people in our country to defy those challenges and to find solutions to them. And so you're looking at a photograph of a young man who was 25 years old at the time that this photograph was taken, and his name is Moses Velapi, and he's standing at a traffic intersection in Johannesburg, and he is advertising his willingness to teach people who are at the intersection, probably for lengthy periods of time if there's load shedding. He's advertising his capacity and his willingness to teach them how to speak Zulu. And so he has found a novel way of coping with these challenges. And the story of Moses Velapi cues us to the importance of understanding that the story of challenges in our country has another side. And that other side is the story of young people's resilience. And so for the purposes of us having a conversation today, let me just make sure that we all understand resilience in the same way, because it's used very diversely. And so when I speak of resilience, I speak of the capacity to be okay and to do okay. In other words, the capacity to overcome challenges that are so significant that they can derail how a system, like a young person, is developing or functioning. I want us to acknowledge that although this capacity is an important capacity, unfortunately, possibly because of the way that it's been bandied about, possibly because of the way that it's been used in the public, possibly because of the neoliberal tendencies of many of our governments, the idea of resilience has unfortunately become trite, particularly to young people who are challenged by lack of employment opportunities, by lack of training and education opportunities. And so what I want us to do today is I want us to reclaim resilience. In Dr. Leclezio's honor, I want us to understand that resilience is misinterpreted when we explain it in a trite, do-it-yourself fashion that focuses on young people being responsible for their resilience. And allied to that, I want us to understand that if resilience is more than a do-it-yourself job, if it involves a whole spectrum of resources, then we need to be aware of the fact that not all those resources are equally meaningful. And then we need to use that understanding to pay these insights forward in a way that is socially responsive. So how am I going to do this? In honor of Dr. Leclezio and her appreciation and championship of participatory work, I'm going to restrict what I talk about today to the Resilient Youth in Stressed Environment study. The RISE study is the acronym that we've used. And the RISE study is a study that we started conducting in South Africa and in Canada way back in 2017, and it ends at the beginning of next year. And the RISE study focused on trying to better understand the resilience of young people living in communities that are dependent on the extraction industry. So very specifically in terms of the extraction industry in both Canada and in South Africa, we looked at communities that were involved in the oil and gas industry. And in South Africa, that included communities that had coal liquefaction plants that were using coal to manufacture oil and gas products. And the reason, just briefly, for us having that focus is that typically communities that are dependent on the oil and gas industry are communities that are exposed to very volatile economic dynamics. And so as a consequence, structural violence is usually heightened in these communities. And it certainly was in the two communities that we worked in South Africa. We started off working in Mbalenhle, in Mpumalanga. And as you can see from my slide, this community was challenged not only by very toxic levels of pollution relating to the industries that they were dependent on for their livelihoods, but also by poor service delivery, overcrowding, very, very limited opportunities for employment, typically what we as South Africans associate with most of the township contexts in our country. From Mbalenhle in 2018, we recruited a sample of about 600 young people, and we worked with most of them until 2020, when COVID began to challenge our capacity to work with them in person. But I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. Similarly, we worked in Zambela, which is also an oil and gas dependent community, but in the Free State, also very closely situated to a coal liquefaction plant, again, characterized by high levels of structural violence and very limited opportunities for employment. We had a smaller sample here. We worked with around 317 young people, and in both communities, the young people that we worked with were between the ages of 14 and 24, and they volunteered to be part of our study because they believed that they had something to teach us about what supports young people to show resilience when they have either experienced the challenges of living in an oil and gas dependent community or the benefits. And interestingly, they did point out some of those benefits to us. So when we started in a true intention to work in the best interests of these communities, we met with stakeholders and young people, and we tried to understand what their proposed focus would be for our work. And they were very keen for us to understand that because of these huge, relentless challenges that they faced and that young people faced in their communities, young people were experiencing a mental health crisis. As you know, you may be aware of the Children's Institute initiated media statement recently about the real concern for the mental health of the young people in our country. The people in these communities told us the same, but they focused on their concern that young people were presenting with symptoms of depression, and to a lesser extent, they thought that young people were engaging in substance abuse, primarily because they were bored, and alternatively because they thought they wanted to self-medicate. And so the stakeholders that we met with, adult and youth, said, help us understand how young people beat depression, or how they can beat depression, and to a lesser extent, substance abuse. And I'm going to focus on the depression part of that in our talk today. So what did we learn from these young people in the course of working with them from 2018 until 2020, and in the case of Zamdela until 2021? Young people were unequivocal, and it should be no surprise to those of us who live in South Africa that for them, the bottom line about growing up in these challenged communities was that their dreams are limited. Dreams of employment, dreams for having opportunities when they could train or be better educated. And as a consequence of these dreams being limited, young people told us that they suffered a lot. Those words, I suffer a lot, are the words of Simpiwe Zulu. You're seeing his photograph on the slide. As part of the participatory ethos of the way that we worked, we invited a group of young people to advise us throughout the project and to help us understand which methods would be best suited and how best to be able to learn from young people about their resilience and their insights into resilience. And Simpiwe and others on this committee and the young people that we worked with were adamant. If we were going to share their stories, which they wanted us to do, they wanted us to share their photographs and their names. And so Simpiwe said, as a result of dreams being limited, he suffered a lot. But that was not the end of his story. Instead, for Simpiwe, the biggest story was this belief that he can still make it, and that in support of this future-orientedness, he had developed certain habits. And if you had the privilege of talking with Simpiwe, he would have told you that these habits included nurturing his own health, searching for knowledge that could further his future and the future of his family, and that he was choosing to associate with positive-minded people and to think positive thoughts and to read positive literature. But this emphasis on I can still make it was not only Simpiwe's. When we worked with focus groups of young people in the community, and when we invited them to explain to us what their resilience was about, we heard very similar stories to Simpiwe's. And in fact, one of the phrases that echoed across the groups was this idea that to be resilient in the context of these communities, young people needed a warrior spirit. And a warrior spirit meant that they needed the capacity to push back, to fight relentlessly against these relentless odds. And in a way, they were telling us that in the context of structural violence, they needed the capacity for counter-violence and for resistance. Now, while I believe it's incredibly important that we honor that capacity, I want to remind us that resilience is only partly about that personal capacity. It's only partly about personal or psychological ruggedness. even though when we first started speaking to young people in these communities, that was the dominant narrative. It was about this warrior spirit and this personal ruggedness. If we look at the resilience literature, and if we engage with concerns about neoliberal tendencies when people stick to the idea that resilience is just a set of psychological strengths, then we are reminded that resilience is two parts: resources. And what that means is that although individual strengths matter, what matters even more is the resources that young people have access to. And so when we worked with young people, when we spoke with them, when we listened to them, we began to hear that there was an additional part to their story. And that additional part to their story confirmed what resilience researchers have been trying to persuade the public to understand better for a long period now. And that is that the resilience of children, of young people, of young adults depends on multiple factors, some of them within young people themselves, but most of them in the systems that young people are connected to. And so if I put that into a visual format for you, then what you are looking at on my screen is a diagram that Dr. Michael Unger, whom I've had the privilege of working with for probably 15 years now, and I proposed in an article that we published in The Lancet to shift or swing attention to the fact that resilience is more than just a set of psychological strengths. Instead, resilience is a compendium or a mix, if you like, of resources that are drawn from the multiple systems that young people are connected to and then also have within themselves, like their physical health, their biological capacities, and their psychological strengths. And so I want to illustrate parts of that for you using what we learned from young people in the RISE study. And if you have a look at the quotes on the slide that I'm showing you now, what I'm hoping is jumping out for you is the fact that this capacity for a warrior spirit, this capacity to be future-oriented, to fight, to push for a better future, was co-inspired or co-facilitated, mostly by young people's family members. So we heard lots about siblings. We heard even more about mothers and mother figures. We heard some about grandfathers and very occasionally about fathers. But if we put all of that together, young people's stories taught us that resilience is co-facilitated. It wasn't only co-facilitated by people in their family, it was also co-facilitated by people in the community. There was quite a bit of talk, particularly amongst the young women, about the fact that in the contexts where we were working, it was typically so that young men were more likely to find employment, related partly to the fact that in the coal liquefaction industry, physical strength is important, and the stereotype of young men, or perhaps it's just the physical reality of young men being stronger, meant that young men were more likely to get jobs. But there was a pushback. Part of the warrior spirit meant that young women had begun to say, enough, we're going to change that. We're going to show that we can do anything and that we can be successful too. And they weren't alone in it. When young women were encouraged to tell us more about that story of the fight to establish themselves as worthy citizens of those communities and as having the right to a life of dignity, they began to tell us about family and community members who co-facilitated that intention and who helped them improve their qualifications or gave them access to resources that they needed. Not surprisingly, given the fact that we were working mostly with young people who self-identified as being African and who spoke to us about the importance of having traditional African values, lots of their determination to have a better future was co-inspired by their desire to improve the realities of their families and their communities. And so the excerpts that you're seeing on my slide are telling you that young people were motivated because they wanted to make a difference, not just for themselves. We heard those words often. It's not just for us, it's for us, it's for my family, it's for my community. And that was the reason that they were pushing forward. Sometimes young people cued us to the fact that it wasn't only human resources that co-facilitated their resilience. Sometimes they included their appreciation of spaces and places, physical spaces and places in their community where they could forget about the relentless challenges, where they could nurture their physical health by exercising, where they could be with their peers and like-minded community members. And typically they linked those spaces and places to big industry, and to big industry that had understood that industry has a responsibility to invest in the communities where they are currently functioning. So if I put that all together for you, and if I go back to the diagram, I have a wonderful colleague and friend in England who refers to this as the onion diagram. If I take us back to the diagram that Dr. Michael Unger and I proposed, so that one can have a kind of like a visual understanding of the importance of understanding resilience as a multi-systemic composite, then you can see that with the exception of the natural environment, which was too dry and too dusty and too barren in both of these township contexts to yield resources that young people found meaningful, with the exception of that, young people were actually reporting this mix of multi-systemic resources. You would have seen from the preceding slides, and certainly if you had access to the entire data set, you would know that what they emphasized was resources within themselves, their own psychological ruggedness, and resources within their social environment. And we'll talk about possible reasons for that in a moment. But despite that emphasis, there was this mix that included biological capacities and resources in the built environment. I do want to cue us to the importance of noticing that there is a need here for us to be socially responsive and to work with young people to help them fight back. The fact that being male in these contexts was a privilege certainly needs redress. And the fact that the only resource in the built environment that young people refer to was the recreation center that had been sponsored by industry is worrying. It tells us, if we put it all together, that resilience is not a do-it-yourself job, but it also tells us that what's missing in that understanding is sufficient attention to how we can upgrade the built and the natural environment that young people are living in so that it becomes supportive of their resilience. When Professor Adrian van Breda from the University of Johannesburg and I did a review of the resilience studies across Africa to try and understand what enables our young people's resilience, we did find evidence of natural and built environment resources. And typically these were safe green spaces, spaces that are litter-free, built environments like libraries that were welcoming of young people and didn't chase them away or frown at them. Very importantly, they were spaces where there were adults who could keep people who prey on younger people at a safe distance. But then there was also the reference to adequate housing that could withstand climate change threats, but also housing that's not so overcrowded that young people are exposed to risks of maltreatment and have no space for privacy. And then compound housing, the idea that when there are large numbers of family members living together in a compound, that young people have better chances of having access to resources and being protected. So there is evidence in the resilience literature that the natural and built environment can be used. It's not being used in the context where we worked, because I think we haven't done enough to support young people to access those resources. So that was the first part that I wanted us to be very aware of, that resilience is not a do-it-yourself job. It requires this multi-systemic mix. But the second part is that within that multi-systemic mix, not all resources are equal. And so I use the question that was posed by Dr. Michael Unger a while ago, when he did his best to cue people to the idea that we need to begin to understand that protective factors or processes are going to matter more depending on which young people we work with, which outcomes we're hoping to achieve, and what the context, including the level of risk exposure is of those young people that we are working with. And so he refers to that as being attentive to the differential impact of resilience enabling resources, the idea that they have differential value or more or less meaning depending on who you are working with, at what point in time, and in which context. And so I'm just going to use two examples or two factors to illustrate that for us today. And the first is that if we mean business, if we mean to champion the resilience of South African young people, then we need to understand that their situational and their cultural context is going to play into which resources are more likely to be available, but also which resources they find more meaningful. And so I'll use a single example, and that is the example that we often assume that when young people grow up in a family that is not a nuclear family, for example, a family that is a mother-headed household, a family that's being headed by perhaps a grandmother, that they are at a disadvantage. That's an assumption that's often bandied about in policy discussions and in conversations where people haven't stopped to understand that that might not be the case. And so to counter that assumption, I'm going to share with you part of a video that was made by the young people in the RISE study. In 2022, when we had collected all the data and co-analyzed the data with the support of young people, we said to young people, if we were to give this back to you and to ask you to compose a message that you think communities really need to hear, so that they can better understand what needs to be done to support the resilience of young people living in communities like yours, who have limited opportunities for education and training, message would you like to give? And so they proposed to make a video. They scripted the video themselves. They speak in the video themselves. And I'm going to play you a short snippet. The first part is a little inaudible. I apologize for that. You will meet Tulani. You saw his picture earlier. And Tulani is very soft-spoken by nature, but he's talking about the importance of his grandmother and how she inspired him to keep learning, even though when he first matriculated, he didn't have the kind of marks that he needed to pursue the education opportunities that he wanted to, and how she inspired him to keep learning and to go back to school. Here is what they want you to hear.
In our house, we have a coal stove, so we use newspapers to light it. I'm usually the one who does it. My granny told me if I'm going to burn the paper, I have to make sure that I know what's written on that paper. So every paper that I threw in the stove, I made sure that I know the information on that paper. She sometimes asked me questions about that paper. And I was like, no ways, she won't see me, But she was always asking, what is that paper you threw in? So that was the thing that kept me reading the papers.
Kubazali, abo gogo, abo malume, abo auntie, nabazali are prominent.
My mother, because she do everything for me, and if I need him, he's there for me.
I told you, despite the assumption that living in a mother-headed household or a grandmother-headed household is probably not the best for young people, these young people are telling us that their mothers, their mother figures, are key to their resilience. And in addition to the fact that their mother figures are key, the part of the video where they were saying that the aunties, the uncles, everybody, the parents are prominent, they were saying that in their experience and in their understanding of the RISE data, the mainstay of resilience is about more than just the immediate family. It includes what Professor Mkhize, way back in 2006, referred to as a family community. The idea of a kinship system, of this group of people that are committed to co-raising any young person growing up in that family. And so the young people in our RISE study are telling us we don't need a Western-style nuclear family necessarily. We need a family community that has strong mother figures, and we need a family community that includes a range of relatives who are willing to co-facilitate our resilience. In the South African context, I'm pretty sure you'll understand what the roots of that emphasis are. The fact that so often, particularly during apartheid days, but still today, men are forced into economic migrancy, and so they aren't necessarily available to co-raise and co-support young people. But whatever the reason, young people are telling us that in this context, and in this culture that values human interdependence and human connectedness, a family community is incredibly important. It played out in a lot of the quantitative work that we did. Just briefly, we did a latent class analysis to try and understand in both South Africa and in Canada whether there were differences in whether young people were committed to being involved in the cultural heritage of their communities. And we found two very distinct classes. We found young people who were reporting a nominal cultural allegiance, so they were marginally involved, and then young people who were reporting robust or they were very committed to the cultural heritage of their families and their communities. And what we found in both Canada and in South Africa is that young people who reported this robust cultural allegiance reported statistically significantly lower levels of depression. And in the South African context, in the RISE sample in South Africa, the factor that was most likely to distinguish between young people being robustly engaged in culture versus nominally engaged was how committed they were to their cultural and family traditions, including this idea of valuing a family community. That doesn't mean that all culture is enabling. And I think part of being socially responsive is our duty to work with young people to understand which parts of cultural heritage could perhaps disable resilience. I think, for example, of the powerful studies that have been done in Uganda by Akello and by Stark and colleagues, teaching us that when we live in a culture that encourages young people to be silent, not to report psychological distress and so on, we are actually constraining their resilience. Certainly in the South African context, the idea of hegemonic masculinity and all the practices that drives needs to be contested. And so the fact that being engaged in culture is supportive of resilience doesn't mean that all cultural practices are necessarily going to support resilience. Then just lastly, the level of distress matters. And by that, what I'm going to show you is that the level of depression symptoms that young people report plays into which resilience resources they are more likely to emphasize in their accounts. And so I'm going to refer to a study that we published very recently in Development in Psychopathology. It's open access, so you are welcome to download it. But in this specific study, we reported only results from the Zambela township. We followed 233 young people between 2019 and the beginning of 2021. And these 233 young people had an average age of 17 and a half, most identified as Black African, and the majority were young women. And what we were hoping to learn from them is what their resilience to child and adolescent mental health problems, specifically to depression, looked like over time. And so we used longitudinal mixture modeling, in addition to inviting young people to provide arts-based artifacts. which I'll show you in a moment. But as part of the longitudinal mixture modeling, we used survey data to identify the trajectories of depression over time, over this 3-year period. And we were not surprised, knowing how magnificently resilient most young people in South Africa are. We were not surprised to find that the most common trajectory was of young people reporting very low levels of depression symptomology. There are possible reasons for those low levels, which if we have time, we can talk about, but on the face of it, this is testimony to young people's capacity to beat the odds of these very challenging contexts that they live in. What we were even more interested in than these trajectories was how these trajectories corresponded to the multi-systemic mix of resilience resources that we believe are crucial to resilience. And so again, no surprise, over time, young people who reported the fewest levels or the lowest levels of depression symptomology reported the most diverse mix of resilience enabling resources, whereas young people who reported worsening depression symptoms or who reported these chronically high levels of depression as measured by the Beck's depression inventory reported there was a mix, but it was much less diverse. And so to illustrate what I mean by that diversity, I'm going to include 2 slides. Both slides include drawings that the young people made for us. So we encouraged them to make a drawing that would show us what they understood about what supported young people like themselves or what supported them to show resilience to the challenges of the communities that they were living in. And if young people reported stable, low, or declining depression trajectories, then typically we got a drawing that had multiple little pictures in it, and we got these long explanations of a very diverse mix of resources that mostly included human resources, typically family relationships, but also sometimes peers and other enabling adults in the community. And then lots of reference to culturally valued practices, such as engaging in music or engaging in organized religion and spiritual activities. The opposite was true in young people who reported chronic high depression trajectories or who reported these worsening trajectories of depression over time. Typically, what we found with them was that even if they started off with a diverse mix at time 1, by the time we reached the 3rd time point, at the end of the 3-year period that we worked with them, we were getting drawings that focused on themselves. And so that for us was a very clear indication that although when we started the RISE project, we heard these stories of young people talking about a warrior spirit and about their personal capacity, clearly over time, the focus on the self is not enough. And so if I put that all together for us in closing, what I'm hoping that the RISE study has shown you and that we can take forward is that if we are going to be responsive to the plight of young people in our country, and if we are going to support them to better manage the multiple challenges that they face, including limited opportunities for education and employment, then we need to work with them to understand what mix, what combination of resources is going to be best suited for them in terms of their situational and their cultural context. And we have to find ways to give them access to those resources, to that mix. If we take the very powerful work that Lucy Kluwer and colleagues have done as an example of this, you may know that they tested a number of what they called outcome accelerators of interventions to see which would best support young people to show positive outcomes aligned to the SDGs. And they used ones that are very typically reported in the literature as being powerful. And what did they find? That 3 of those, primarily safe schools, parenting support, and cash transfers, made the difference in young people's outcomes, including mental health outcomes. So they're teaching us, rather than assume that we know what that mix of resources needs to look like, we need to work with young people to better understand what mix they would recommend And we need to bear in mind that that mix, that intervention that's going to advance, that multi-systemic mix of resources should not focus only on the young person. But typically, as in the work that Lucy Kluwer and colleagues did, it's actually about supporting the systems like families and mothers and communities that matter for the resilience of young people. If we fail to do that, then although we recognize that young people's agency is magnificent, must be honored, we probably in the long term are going to drive young people towards what we understand to be ambiguous agency, that they begin to take the kinds of actions that are not positive, like Moses Velapi, but that instead can endanger themselves, that they could become involved in transactional, transactions that could either harm their health or their well-being, or end them up being in prison. So again, I'll stop here, but I'm stopping here by giving you the voices of the young people in the RISE study as part of what they made at the end of the project, because they wanted communities to better understand what is essential for communities to do if they want to be responsive to young people's resilience. They included a song, and I'll play you a snippet of the song. If you'd like the whole song, I'm happy to share it with you afterwards. Together, we can make a change. I believe Dr. Loren Le Clezio is smiling as she hears that, and I believe she would say that these young people know what they are talking about. I hope that we will take their message forward and do what they are asking us to do. I'm going to stop sharing my slides. Petrus, I think that gives us a couple of minutes for questions.